All right, we are about to get started. As prompt as always, like good compliance people are, right at the stroke of noon today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, either whether at the end of your day or you're joining us for lunch. My name is Jackie Minarski. I have the privilege of working at the University of Washington. The mountains are out today, so we're really excited about that. With me today in the great state of Texas is Trace Wilgus, who's the Assistant Athletic Director at the University of Texas. For today's discussion, and I hope all of you out there chime in to make this a discussion on this webinar today. We have the pleasure to facilitate this education session on individuals associated with prospects, or IAWPs. We expect that today's webinar will last between 30 and 45 minutes today. So hope that you can hang out and again stay till the end so we have some questions and answers and the like. It also appears that our Twitter poll today, thanks for the NAAC staff out there, put that up there. Trace is the lucky winner because his area was selected. Non-football coaching staff hires as a point of emphasis. Trace will be all over that when I finally stop talking this afternoon. And again, thank you all for participating today at 127. All of you are making us quite nervous this afternoon. Couple housekeeping items that we'd like to just bring up for the good of our group and of our professional organization. First off, if you haven't already voted on your preference for our new logo, there's really those 4 good options out there. We encourage you to do so. Believe that there's already a lot of votes in there. All votes are due by Friday. You can visit NAACcompliance.com to log that vote. And again, those can be found in the headline stories. Also, convention goes live on Wednesday at noon. So set your calendar for this time tomorrow. If you're planning on joining us, and you should, in Washington, D.C., again, being a Washington native, that's a great city. If you need suggestions, feel free to reach out. Book your room as quickly as possible. We all know those go quick at these conventions. So again, get into that convention and we'll see you there. Again, today's webinar, we encourage each of you to use the chat feature on your screen during today's discussion. You can ask us questions that will be addressed at the end. We also encourage you to highlight anything that you might be doing well or you feel that adds to what we are discussing. Again, this is such an amorphous topic that we'll get into in a little bit, but it's important that we highlight what everyone is doing in regard to this topic. At the conclusion of the webinar, again, we will be posting this recording as well as some resources and forms that are shared during this time and some of the resources that we're using here at Washington and at Texas. And again, if you send them to us or in our sharing community in the NAAC Connect section, that will also be super appropriate as we try to tackle this topic together. So without further ado, I think we need to flip the slide to the regulatory disclosure. You know, the attorneys in the room get this. For slide 2, we appreciate and that this topic, right, is off the bat. We need to say that, like many of the issues we deal with, that IAWPs are institution specific, right? The analysis really seriously depends on risk factors associated with each hire, with each position, with the individuals involved. With different topics there. As we work through this process, we will review what we do here at Washington. Trace will walk us through what he does at Texas, but please keep in mind, we're not preaching here that this is what is exactly what's right. This is what needs to happen. You all have to find what the right pieces are for your institution based on your footprint, based on your risk profile. Hopefully we'll share some things and maybe there'll be a nugget of something that you can take back and work into your world. But again, we appreciate that those of us sitting in the FBS world, I've had the privilege of working at all different levels, that this isn't, we're sitting here from Washington and Texas saying this is what has to be done. We appreciate that there are different risk profiles throughout our membership and on the call today. So just please keep that in mind as we're walking through that. As we're going through, as what we go on, what's on tap today. Next slide. I'll go over a brief history, quick, of IAWP status. I'm a little nerdy like that. Kind of like to know where all this came from. Trace will expertly handle the application and analysis section. We'll both review different things that Texas and Washington are currently implementing to help us get our minds and arms around this topic. We'll have a case study that will be reviewed that Trace will go over. Again, some that he's been dealing with being in his footprint in Texas. Again, the challenges there are a lot. Again, and by this time that we're done by that point, hopefully we've inspired you to ask a question or provide some information sharing. We also were informed that there is no such thing as an international IAWP. There was on some reservation, or if you signed up early, you may have gotten a note that said that welcome to a talk on international IAWPs. Don't worry, that is not a thing. There's not a new category that has been dropped into our world. So no international IAWPs. I just wanted to clarify that for everyone, if anyone was concerned about that. All right, so that's what we have on tap today. I hope you're still interested and you didn't see anyone log off, so hopefully we'll move through this. One of the acronyms, again, in the history world that I was happy that had a short life was the BFG, and because I didn't want it to ruin one of my childhood favorite books of all time. But the BFG was an important group coming out around 2009, I believe, that when the board of directors decided to sponsor some working groups to establish the temperature of what was going on external to what our membership organization and how our governance structure was put in the time. There are people in the world like Chris Richardson and Steve Maloney that can give you a better history lesson on this if you're interested. It actually is an interesting time in the NCAA. But 2009-99, Proposal 2009-99, sponsored by the board of directors, is really where this thing got codified. No, this is because the value placed on the work the BFG did. You can see that one of the first documents created by them really outlines some of the items that we are still dealing with today, and it was a clear articulation that those are the items that in the men's basketball recruiting environment that we all need to be concerned about. So again, the BFG was an extra membership group that created this background for all of us in this. We also know that this has now evolved into the world of women's basketball and football, and likely other sports, but possibly not with the hiring capacity of these two, of women's basketball and football. Really, we know that the industrial complex dealing with youth sports has really ramped up since 2009. There are these niche elite teams, elite trainers and program-specific trainers, 7v7, right, that has moved high school and youth sports, has preempted high school sports and has moved to a youth sport model that is becoming more akin to what men's basketball started with their AAU programs. So again, it seems to have evolved, and again, the concerns that are coming in the women's basketball and football seem to be driven by the youth sport environment that is developing around those sports. So that's how we are in the world today with IAWPs across those three sports. Again, probably figure that there might be other sports that would need it, but we're still just here. I am going to now turn it over to Trace. You've probably heard enough from me to review the application and analysis components.
What we're talking about here with the application analysis is nothing new, so we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but do want to at least set the stage for what we talk about as far as, what our procedures are at Washington and Texas. So just the absolute basics. IAWP definition: any person who maintains contact with a prospect, relatives, or coaches, and whose contact is directly or indirectly related to athletic skills and abilities or recruitment. The other piece on the IAWP status, it's prospect specific. So meaning one IAWP can be an IAWP for multiple prospects. Could be just one, could be 20 based on a team or whatever their affiliations are. And they maintain that status as an IAWP through the prospect exhausting collegiate eligibility. Okay, so those are the basic definitions. It seems pretty clear cut, and we also know there's educational columns and various other clarifications out there that are there to serve as guidance for us in determining who is not an IAWP. But where I think the challenge falls on compliance staffs, we took a quote from a December 2017 basketball oversight subcommittee statement that's on point and transfers that responsibility to the compliance staff, which says any analysis regarding IAWP is inherently subjective, and there are no objective criteria in determining IAWP status, right? So we don't have these set criteria to say if you communicate with a prospect X number of times, or if you've spent X number of months or years in a relationship related to athletics with a prospect, that automatically gets you to the IAWP space. We don't have that. It's all subjective and based on the totality of circumstances. And so that's why I think we're here in this space here today, is to talk a little bit more about what our experiences are, what we feel our best practices are, things that we've done, so that you all can take a couple pieces back to your own respective campus. So next slide. How do I determine IAWP status? So things to consider. The starting point should be to determine the frequency of various contact and communication avenues. It could be once per month, once per week, and over what time period. Okay, so looking at how can this potential IAWP be communicating with a prospect? So you've got in-person contacts, electronic communication, telephone communication, social media interactions. And from there, if you can determine, I think, the frequency of each of those avenues, you can better evaluate the nature of the contact and the circumstances surrounding it so that you can review that relationship in total. Okay, so you're not looking at one factor specifically. We're not looking at, how many times did you initiate a telephone call with them, and only looking at that piece. Everyone communicates differently. So you may have someone's phone records and no calls to a prospect may show up, but you may be missing on the fact that they DM with that individual on social media daily. So again, looking at the various communication and contact avenues and looking at the relationship in total. One thing that has been helpful for us, we have there obtain samples. You may just know it when you see it. Get samples of the communication, assuming it's electronic, between the IAWP and the prospect. If we're looking to hire a non-coaching staff member in football that may be an IAWP, and he says he emails prospects once per month, and you obtain samples of that communication, and it's only once a month, but it maybe reveals significant levels of interaction, and they just kind of express a familiarity or closeness, that may mean more to you than just hearing once per month and outright disregarding that and saying that that's not maintaining contact. And so on the flip side, you may be looking at a non-coaching staff candidate who may tell you, I've sent Twitter DMs to prospects bi-weekly for the past 3 months, but if you ask for samples of what that looked like, you get the communication, you see it's maybe isolated to solely confirming comp tickets for institutions contests, or maybe just sending administrative emails and itineraries for unofficial visits. That's going to look a little bit different, I think, in your review of that relationship in total. And so lastly, how do I determine IAWP status? Use your conference and NCAA interpretations processes. Obviously, we can analyze things at the campus level, but the stakes that we're dealing with determining IAWP status and then giving a sign-off to either move forward with a hire or not move forward with the hire, and the consequences that come from those decisions are high stakes. We're talking about eligibility of individuals in question. So obviously make the determinations that are comfortable making at the institutional level, but they then use the NCAA and conference interpretations processes from there. Next slide. So two aspects of IAWP legislation. Last really quick basic before Jackie and I talk a little bit more about what we do at Washington, Texas. So we know we've got two clear, separate, and distinct aspects of the IAWP legislation. The first is camps and clinics. So in football and basketball, hiring an IAWRP individual associated with the recruited prospect triggers the legislation unless 2 years have elapsed since the prospect's initial full-time enrollment at the institution. And then they do have that limited carve-out exception for football to be permitted to hire 4-year NCAA member institutions coaches at camps or clinics, even if that individual is an IAWRP. Again, that is a football-specific thing. On the non-coaching staff side, football and men's basketball in the same bucket, hiring an IAWP within a 2-year period before and after projected or actual enrollment. And then women's basketball also has the legislation, but you see there we bolded and underlined RP. They're a little bit different than football and men's basketball because they have the individual associated with the recruited prospect designation, but then it's back to the same legislation, 2-year period before or after projected or actual enrollment. Again, those are the two aspects of the IAWP legislation. Just looking at those separately, we'll talk a little bit more about what our procedures are in those separate spaces. But one thing to make sure that is noted there is the expanded definition of recruited status in football and basketball. More on this later on, but I think a lot of the triggers that can trigger recruited status now, beyond just the traditional, what we've known, official visits, off-campus contacts, offers of aid, things that expanded more into verbal offers of aid, sending recruited correspondence, and how we believe that kind of should now transfer some responsibility a little bit outside of compliance and back to the coaching staff. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we do at Texas and Washington, what our best practices are here a little bit later on. So with that, I'll go to the next slide, and we'll kick it to Jackie to talk a little bit about things they do at UW.
All right, can you all still hear me? I had a funny message. Anyway, so at Washington, right, it's not just what we're doing here at Washington, and I hope other people are involved in this, in their HR process. It's, part of exploring this webinar has been talking with many of you and talking about what's happening, and it was a little bit disconcerting about who's getting involved in hiring when. And so it occurred to us that possibly being on the front foot here, Washington, has put us in a really good position to deal with all those random people that just keep showing up in your football offices at random times throughout the year, and you go over there and there just seems to be new faces over there, and you just might not know who's coming and going. Your HR staff, these hires move quickly, but they've got to be your best friends. This isn't what we do at Washington. I believe this is a Kansas screenshot of their university HR portal. Our intern had applied for a job there, and amazing interns was like, look what they have. You should get this. So this had prompted her when she applied for a position there. And I think this is Kansas, and if anyone from Kansas wants to chime in and see how this is working, that this is an automatic prompt within their institution hiring system. But we have a little bit of a more informal process at Washington. We can go to the next slide. We get emails from our business office, the HR individuals, and this is a slimmed down screenshot of this, but it mostly, in other cases, has categories such as positions to be hired, open positions, hiring managers of each positions, individuals leaving UW. so that we can be on the front foot. If we see coaching staff and non-coaching staff members within these 3 sports leaving, that we know that we need to either start doing some education of new hiring managers and or of being part of the hiring process. Here you can see we had a coordinator of sports science, which is a new position, and the hiring manager is Tim Soha, one of our strength and conditioning coaches. So again, as we're evaluating for red flags, these are all pieces of information that are helpful for you about who is the hiring manager, what kind of position we're looking at. The program coordinator was replacing an individual, and the hiring manager there is the CFO of football operations now. So we're dealing with 2 different groups here, and we can go through what we went through at Washington in dealing with these 2 positions that just started yesterday, actually. But again, the key part here is our HR us, because they're appreciating where we are and having to get some pre-offer paperwork to these individuals. So that's our process. If we flip to the next slide, that we need to get some paperwork done and all hires cleared through compliance pre-offer, which is a really nice place. And our business office is another group that holds lines with us and has been fantastic. So again, when you're doing this, an institutional review of positions, the coordinator of sports science, it's a new job, so sometimes that can be a little scary if a position is created for someone with someone in mind. But when you looked at the position posting, it had a master's degree. They needed multiple software competencies, the catapults, all like kind of up on the new technology to integrate new nutrition and some of the new fitness technology that's in the world. Previous experience was pretty significant. Also had managed people. And then finally for me, what made me feel really comfortable about this person would be externally facing, in other words, not just beholden to a football staff, but working with our doctors and our director of nutrition and head athletic trainer. So while the new position might be a red flag, there are other components of the job description that made us feel better. We also have started with the football staff that the resumes are sent over to us in terms of who's applying for those jobs. And on the front end, reviewing who is applying for these jobs. If they're not meeting minimum requirements or they have never worked in this before, or might be red flags, again, for you to allocate your resources and maybe assess the risk at higher that maybe there's something a little bit more going on here. Just kind of Trey said earlier that it might be it's not just the frequency of the communication, it's the quality of it. So again, resumes can and will tell you a lot about what position someone's applying to. On the other hand, this program coordinator started raising red flag. It was a previously held position. The job skills were less specific. It was sport-specific responsibility. There was no decision-making. There was minimal requirements. The famous tasks to be assigned, that was a few red flags for us. Thankfully, these were both internal hires for us, promotions and part of a reorg. But there were people that had applied externally that we would have had some interesting IAWP conversations about had they been given these jobs. But at Washington, it's great for us to be on the front foot in the hiring process, that we get to have these vetting moments and discussions prior to offers, even offers of to these individuals to come work at Washington, that we get to have a sign-off specifically. So that, I think we're going to go back, to Trace for Texas now, to go through what he has to go through down there in Texas.
Okay, so just talk a little bit about our procedures. I talked about the 2 aspects of the IAWP legislation, obviously being camps and clinics and non-coaching staff. And so we'll try and structure what we do that way in terms of how we talk about this. We'll start with camps and clinics. So we start kind of our basic front line of vetting IAWP status for hiring of camp employees in football and basketball with the standard employment form, okay? So it's probably no different than what anybody has in place that they require for all camp employees to fill out for compliance purposes. That serves as our primary disclosure for IAWP status, right? So we have the specific question on there: are you an individual associated with a prospect? Yes or no? And so that's the basic disclosure there. But I think what helps us then gather more information is we also ask for the last 6 to 7 years. And the reason why we ask that time frame is we feel like that gets us to the space where we could be identifying anybody who triggered IAWP status with a high school freshman all the way through that 2-year period after being a current student athlete at our institution. So we ask for the last 6 to 7 years, what was your employment history, either as a high school coach or a non-scholastic AAU 7-on-7, whatever the case may be, coach. Provide us with your complete employment history for the last 6 to 7 years. And so from there, that gets us more information about candidates to where we may be able to see, okay, we've got candidate John Smith, who was maybe at Katy High School for 2 years. He was at Skyline High School for 2 years, and he was at Anderson High School for 1 year. So now we as a compliance staff know, okay, we've got 3 high schools, 3 potential groups of prospects in play for which this one individual could trigger IAWP status, okay? And so we will basically put together a spreadsheet. You can go down to that 4th bullet point there that we have. We'll put together a spreadsheet of all potential camp employees with all of their affiliations, high schools, 7-on-7 teams, AAU teams, compile all of that into a spreadsheet where we've got it all in one place. And then we provide that to the basketball and the football staff. And we kind of work together to cross-reference all of those high schools, all of those AAU teams, all of those 7-on-7 teams with designations in our recruiting software system. So we at Texas, we use ACS here. So we'll basically take all those high schools, potentially cross-reference them with anybody who's tagged as being at that high school, at that 7-on-7 AAU program within their respective sports recruiting database. And if there's anything that matches up, that individual is wiped as a potential employee. We've also got obviously a couple other avenues that we as a compliance staff alone can do, just doing some basic research, Google searches on who the individual is may turn up some things on the person that you may just not get from a disclosure form or an employment history saying where they've been. So we do that on a case-by-case basis. And then we also review compliance documentation. Things that we may have internally. It could be unofficial visit pass lists. It could be coach comp pass lists. Anything that we may have internally, if we have a reason for red flags, we don't ever want anything to be coming up to where we have that in our records and we just failed to check that. So we will do a spot checking of our compliance documentation on a case-by-case basis as well. But, with the expanded definition of recruited status and its application in camps and clinics, and I think everybody probably knows what I'm talking about. I'm going to rattle off a couple. So providing recruiting materials, soliciting attendance at camps or clinics, receiving telephone calls, offering verbal offers of aid, or an oral commit to the institution. All those things trigger recruited status now for a prospect. So all of those things all have one kind of common theme, in that unless you have an intimate knowledge and of what the nature of the recruiting process is in that sport for all of those prospects, compliance is probably going to have no reason to know if our staff has sent recruiting correspondence to a kid or if we verbally offered a kid. That's not going to be publicly known or available information for us. So what we try to make sure that we do is we transfer the responsibility for signing off on camp employees to the coaching staff. We know that's not going to necessarily absolve compliance of not doing any kind of review or not doing our due diligence, but hopefully this is a collaborative effort between you and your coaches in sports to work together to identify who is a realistic camp employee to where we're dealing with this kind of high-risk area that we can get to a space where we're working together to identify who's a reasonable employee for us. So again, we circulate that to that list, that spreadsheet that's got all the designations to head coaches and assistant coaches. We require each individual head coach, assistant coach to sign off on camp employees before we will give the go-ahead for them to employ them. And then obviously in the football space, we also require our player personnel, is what we call them here, but it's your recruiting department in football. We require those individuals who may be working in those units to also sign off on camp employees. Just, depending on what the nature of what your football staff looks like, these are the individuals that typically coordinate your mass mailers, your recruiting logistics for coaches. So sometimes they may know of potential kids that may trigger the recruited status that, your offensive coordinator, your defensive coordinator, who's maybe not focusing 2 or 3 classes out, they may not have that knowledge. So that's why I think it's helpful to make sure that you're involving your player personnel or your recruiting staff in that review of camp employees. This is a high-risk area, obviously, for us on camps and clinics with football, just because of the nature of high school football in our state. We're right in the middle of Dallas, Houston, where you've got any X number of top prospects in the country located within a 2 to 3 mile, 2 to 3 hour driving radius of Austin. And just the nature of high school football in the state in terms of, what it means to communities, high school coaches, and the status that they have in the state. This legislation has really narrowed the scope on who we can even employ at our camps. Because if you assume outright that any coach is an IAWP for prospects at that school, we've at any given point taken any high school that we may recruit from in this state and probably slashed in half who we can even employ, just because, again, of the expanded definition of recruited status. And if we've sent any template mailer to a junior at a specific school, that may have wiped us from employing any coach at that high school. So for us, the risk just hasn't been worth it, and why we haven't done a whole lot of in-depth analysis on the camps and clinic side of getting into specific relationships. We've just taken the broad sweep of, if you're employed at a high school or you have been at anywhere where we may have triggered recruited status for, we're just not going to mess with employing any coaches from those schools. So again, it's really limited the footprint for us in terms of who we can even employ at our camps and clinics. Transitioning to non-coaching staff. So what our procedures are at Texas in terms of the compliance side of making sure that we're reviewing and monitoring hires of sports-specific non-coaching staff members or just non-sport-specific non-coaching staff members. We kind of lump our procedures into 2 separate buckets. So we deal with basketball and football a certain way, and then we kind of just deal with everyone else a certain way. So with basketball and football, we're involved early in the process on a hire. So we typically work with the staff to gather information and vet candidates before things even get too far down the road in terms of talking interviews and offer letters and things like that. I would say our guidance in this space would be to be proactive. Jackie talked about some things that they have at Washington about hearing from HR about when they have transitions, when someone's leaving, when positions are coming open. Be proactive. If you see that an administrative assistant or a director of operations or a special assistant, whatever the title is, in football or basketball is coming open, go ahead and reach out to the sports staff. Go ahead and reach out to the head coach, see what they're thinking, and remind them to make sure that they come back through your staff once candidates have been identified, so that we can make sure there's obviously no red flags from an IAWP standpoint before the hire just moves forward. I think the challenging nature of this basketball and kind of football space with the hiring is what the hiring process actually looks like, right? So the hiring of a director of operations or a quality control in football isn't going to be the same as us posting our entry-level compliance job. So we don't just go and post it on we have to post it on the NCAA Career Market, or we have to post it on our institutional website, and it has to be open for 2 weeks. And then we vet the candidates, and we go through phone interviews and in-person interviews and all that kind of stuff. We all know that's not what the hiring process looks like for basketball and football. I mean, typically these coaches, they have in mind, they're having conversations with potential candidates, maybe even before the position is open. And so that's why it becomes even more important to make sure that you're being ingrained with the staff on the front end of the process, vetting candidates, collecting information from them, again, before things move forward too much to where an offer is potentially being extended, or even getting a contract signed and in place before you've been able to do anything in terms of vetting, whether there's any trickle-down effect with that individual being considered an IWP. As far as everyone else, what we do here at Texas, kind of outside of the basketball and football sport-specific hires, is unless we have a reason to be proactive, where we're involved in the vetting and the hiring of it, we really just defer to a disclosure that's incorporated into our normal HR hiring forms and processes. So just as they do with any other individual who's going to be employed at Texas, there's a slew of paperwork that they have to fill out. We've incorporated a disclosure form into that process to where they have to answer the questions about whether they're affiliated with any specific prospect in basketball or football, or whether they're affiliated with any current student athlete at Texas in basketball or football. And unless there is a yes answer, our human resources staff just manages that process, saves that with all their documentation on their end, and we only receive yes answers to do any vetting from there. I think we would acknowledge that may leave a space where we've maybe left ourselves open a little bit, but we feel comfortable in the sense that if we go through a full hiring process where we hire a groundskeeper and there hasn't been any involvement by the specific sports staff, then we're going to have a significant level of mitigation that we feel like to deal with any problems that may come up. So we really just rely, I feel like, on rules education with our HR staff and hiring managers on that front, and then defer any checks to really just, again, that disclosure that's incorporated into the HR forms. So next slide. So some best practices, again, so Jackie and I have talked a little bit about what we do at Washington and Texas. I would say that, we're not here to tell you that that's what every school should be doing. It's, again, depending on your own risk level of your institution or the position or the sport, exactly what you're dealing with. But what we feel like are maybe some best practices for all institutions to probably at least consider seeing if there's a way that you can take this back to your own respective campus. Just making sure that on the camps and clinics front, that there's some kind of review of compliance documentation going on. So again, you're going to administer your camp employee forms. You're going to do all those things with your potential employees, but just making sure that there's some kind of cross-referencing and review of compliance documentation that's only internal, so that you're doing some level of due diligence on your end. It could be, again, unofficial visit forms, recruiting logs, comp admissions, anywhere where you may see IWP names pop up. And then the last thing, again, like we talked about, put the responsibility on the coaches. Again, this all kind of goes back to the IAWP now designation, and the expanded definition, just to harp on it, of the recruited status. That's all intimate knowledge to the coaching staff, things that the general public probably isn't aware of, things that recruiting services, you probably can't glean that information from doing basic searches out there. It's not going to be on any type of internal compliance logs that you're going to have. So make the head coach, make the assistant coaches, make that player personnel and recruiting staff sign off on the camp employees that you're moving forward with, because ultimately it's that responsibility is going to fall back on them. So go ahead and put that on them on the front end. Non-coaching staff on that side, again, things to consider: incorporating some kind of check or disclosure within the HR process. So if an individual is already having to go through the hiring process to where they're completing various, state and institutional forms, why not just have an extra NCAA disclosure in there, the screenshot that Jackie had up there, or it could be the separate form. If it's a hard copy thing, just whatever, again, works best on your campus. Second thing to consider, I think, making sure as best you can get on the front end of basketball and football hires. So the second that you find out either new positions are going to be posted or transitions are going to happen within a respective sport or coaching staff, reaching out to whoever your point of contact is on that sport, making sure that they know that you need to be involved in the process and the vetting of candidates, again, before it gets too far down the road. And then the reviewing of job postings, as Jackie had talked about, seeing exactly what the job duties are going to look like. If it's, high levels of prerequisites or specialized types of things, that's probably going to leave less of a space where you're going to be hiring an IAWP who may have no business being qualified for that type of thing. Some last things which are really applicable to anything, borrow and hijack forms. I don't think any of us are in this business to recreate the wheel or invent new processes. So make sure you using your NAAC colleagues, colleagues at other schools, similar types of peer institutions. We're going to have the same types of similar issues that we have as other, Power 5 schools in our state and in our conference. So sharing best practices amongst that group, and then also just focusing back on the rules education. So you can implement all the types of compliance procedures and checks on the back end and things that you can, but making sure that you're doing your due diligence, educating HR, hiring managers, camp coordinators, and then obviously your football and basketball staffs, which is where this legislation is obviously impacting, to make sure that they know and understand things that they can and can't do. Some additional considerations we got down there, just, I don't think that we feel like these are necessarily best practices or things that are reasonable for every types of consideration, but things just to consider if red flags are ever present. Jackie had, I think, talked to a colleague at another school where, they suggested maybe continued or post-hire monitoring. Is that individual actually doing the job? So if you've got red flags about somebody, following up on that side, which may involve some HR involvement, emergency contact information. I think that's an incredible source of information, whenever red flags may be present that may reveal some more information about what a relationship actually looks like. If a prospect lists an individual as his emergency contact, what does that say about them that may mean more than the information that you have at hand? Doing interviews, obviously during the hiring process, if you're on the front end of football and basketball, you may be interviewing candidates, talking to them, and then also reaching out to potentially other schools that are involved in the recruitment of prospects. Certain schools may have dealt with certain individuals during campus visits that you may not have seen. So just using, I think, the resources at your disposal to make sure that you're gathering all the information that's available and out there. So that's all I kind of have on best practices. Jackie, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, you crushed it right there. I think it's kind of appropriate that we take one of the questions we got for right now, if that's okay with you, Trace. That's the what are some of the best practices for vetting a former college coach moving into a non-coaching staff role member? Great question. I guess that's what you all saw when I wrote back good one, because in our side chat I didn't turn off the note to everyone. But I do think that the best practices in terms of, I think it fits in really well here. When you've got a former coach, is the part about contact the other schools. Again, this is a moment where we all can't be shy. If you're hiring one of my former coaches, I've got a treasure trove of information for you about who and where they were contacting, what their recruiting footprint looked like, who their key contacts were, and that should be information that, as a group, we should be able to disclose to each other to help you make those decisions based on whether or not the non-coaching staff role, he would trigger IAWPs for the same footprint. I think that, as Trace had mentioned, the areas in which we live and work are really highly determine our risk factors. So if you're hiring someone from Seattle and from West Coast, and you are someone on the East Coast, again, how regionalized football recruiting is these days, again, might be an easier hire for that person than, again, someone in our same conference footprint where we're trampling over each other in the same prospects. So again, as a former college coach moving to a non-coaching staff role, that's one that to engage their former compliance staff. And again, these people, the IAWPs, the people that are trying to get these jobs are applying to all of our jobs. So don't reinvent the wheel, and let other people help you identify these prospects. Trace, anything to add to that question?
Yeah, so again, just want to make sure I repeat what the question was. So the question was, what are some best practices for vetting a former college coach moving into a non-coaching staff role? So I think Jackie hit the nail on the head. Yeah, so I think Jackie hit the nail on the head. The main thing I think to focus on whenever you're hiring that former college coach is who are they an IAWP for based on who they were recruiting at their previous institution, and determine, A, what prospects does that overlap with who you as an institution are also currently recruiting, and then B, who was that individual maybe involved with recruiting that may be on your current institution's roster. So there may obviously be some implications there. If you have a freshman who you're hiring a former coach from another institution who he recruited at his institution, but he may still trigger being an IAWP for it. Again, now we're getting into the space where we're talking about things that this may or may not have been intended for, but until a proposal that we'll talk about in a little bit gets adopted, that's the environment that we're dealing with. And where that is, I think a significant challenge for us as compliance professionals is all of the turnover in football. And so every January and every December, whenever we have X number of coaching and head coaching transitions and the trickle-down effect that affects, 10 to 20 people at every school, we're seeing a space where maybe, an assistant coach who got let go, maybe he can't immediately find another assistant coaching job. So what does he do? He goes into a quality control position, or he goes into some kind of non-coaching staff position at another school. And then that's where it becomes obviously our problem to deal with, to where, we're hiring this non-coaching staff member. He triggers the legislation, and we have to determine who he is an IWP for based on, who he triggered that for by simply performing permissible job duties as his previous institution. So who was he calling? Who was he contacting? Who was he emailing with? And how does that overlap with your recruiting footprint or, again, your current roster at your institution? So that was a good question there.
Yeah, and again, it's evaluating if they do trigger, then the factors, like what were they maintaining contact, or was it like a brief interaction? What was the quality of and frequency of the contact, duration, the nature of the contact? Again, those are then factors that also come back into play, as with anything here. Great question.
All right, so kind of the last thing that we want to talk about real quick, just a case study. We titled this one "The Elephant in the Room" because I think it's the one that's kind of out there that we all know is there, and we put out the Twitter poll about what people wanted to hear about, and I think overwhelmingly it was hiring in football. So let's talk about a specific example and walk through it, what it looks like, and things to consider if you end up having similar transitions and hires on your respective campus. So let's say we've got a director of player personnel. Maybe he got let go or he transitioned to another role. So this player personnel, again, being pretty much your director of recruiting. So how the hiring process actually works. So I talked about that, a slide or two ago. It's not going to go probably through the normal posting and interview process. You're going to have your hiring manager or your head coach probably soliciting candidates and having those conversations before things even move forward on the HR side. Let's say he's in a similar role at a peer institution. That peer institution may not even know that the conversations are taking place, that you're going to poach him to your own respective institution. So we're just going to focus on the compliance side of things right now, and not necessarily how many HR best practices or hiring rules that the staff may or may not be violating by going through the hiring process this way. But what we would do and what we've done whenever we've had a similar transition here before is our first step in information collection from candidates is we would request and require the individual to send us a list of any prospect that they have ever communicated with or been involved with the recruitment of at their current institution. And so we would get that list. It could be 60, it could be 20, it could be 100, just depending on what that director of player personnel does in their respective job duties at their institution. And so that's going to be the other kind of, thing that you need to feel out, thing that you need to interview that individual for is, we may have 3 or 4 player personnel individuals on our staff at Texas. 3 of them may never communicate with kids other than campus visits, but 1 may be heavily involved, and those are the ones that you obviously need to make sure that you're vetting. So information collection, obviously getting that list first, and then step 2, what we would do in that process is cross-reference that list of prospects that you get from him or her, cross-reference that with your own institution's recruiting list. So using the recruiting database, using your coaches to identify, where there may be some prospect overlaps there with kids that are on your radar at your current institution. Step 3, I think find out where the overlaps are. So he may have sent you a list of 50 and you've identified 20 kids that were on that radar and also on your school's radar. So now you're like, okay, we've got the list whittled down to 20. Now we need to request telephone records, maybe a summary of communication. Going back to the slide that we talked about, how do I determine IAWP status, requesting all of that information, and requesting, again, screenshots and specific logs of that communication. We've done that in a couple different scenarios here, and it'll drive you insane, I think, going through some of the communication that these individuals have with 16 and 17-year-old kids, but it's the reality of what we're dealing with. You might know IAWP when you see it. If you've just got checking in once a month, seeing if, hey, do you want to come to a game? Like, that's going to look a lot different than actual solicitation in the recruitment process in that communication. So again, getting as much information as you can so you've got the total picture of what that relationship looks like. So just talking through, an example that we've had. So say you whittle that list down to about 20 kids who he's an IWP for, who you think he may be, and are also on your institution's list. You go through that in detail. You maybe say, yes, you're an IWP for 5. No, you're not for these 5. But for these 10, we're not really sure. That's where you go, again, and use the NCAA processes, using AMA from the interpretive side, and then obviously, hopefully, if you're involved on the front end of the hire, using CLR from a proactive waiver standpoint, and going through, obviously, the exhaustive process that you have there. Again, we've been through this situation fully through both AMA and CLR, so I'm happy to talk offline about any specific scenarios that we've had, and I'd be also interested to hear from colleagues about any scenarios that you've been through with either of those groups at the NCAA, because, again, we're dealing with a really subjective space in terms of determining who an IAWP is, and then there's a lot of different scenarios and mitigating circumstances, that put us in this position. You've got staff overhauls every December and January, reasons for hiring these people, and so I think all the information and best practices that we can share, the better. The last thing that we have talked about here that may be a takeaway for those of you who are operating in a similar space as us is, there's probably similar language and forms that are likely already signed in HR, but it may be a good practice once you get through this information collection with candidates to require them to sign an affidavit of sorts that indicates that their hiring is contingent upon the information provided. Just in case information is subsequently revealed that may be contrary to what you knew at the time, you may have signed off on saying, yes, this individual is not an IAWP for this person, but then you learn about information after that person's been hired. Again, it may or may not help you. It may not absolve you of the situation, but it's just some additional piece of mitigation that may be considered for reinstatement and or enforcement. So that's the case study we'll have. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Trace.
Yeah, go ahead, Jackie. Take us home.
Yeah, one of the questions that came in, I think, goes along and sequences nicely into that. Sorry to jump from the end to questions on this. The question came in, the general extends to hiring any position within your athletic department. Are your HR disclaimers incorporated for all athletic department hires, or do you just process those for sports? In terms of HR disclosures, yes. I think we are doing them across the board for all departmental hires. At Washington, we're getting it in the onboarding process, so we might not be as proactive as Trace had mentioned that he does as well. On the front foot of the director of ops or in the sport program specifically, but we do have a new onboarding process here at Washington that we are incorporating at least a disclosure on whether or not their involvement, whether our marketing person that got hired completely to do non-football and basketball stuff is someone who might trigger that status later on. And then we are also starting to incorporate affidavits. Again, it's not going to relieve you of duties to monitor, but at least it's something that there is an attestation somewhere that individual, based on the information that was available and ready, is something that is signed off and you have in your back pocket that you were doing your due diligence in that space to look for IAWP statuses and triggers there. Anything else to add there, Trace? We can get one of those questions done.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think we had a question or more of a comment come in. I think the frustration many have is when the IAWP legislation is not being applied, when a coach leaves our institution and goes to another institution in a non-coaching role and the recruitment doesn't cease. Yeah, I think that's perhaps a blind spot. Again, where some schools and coaches are just thinking that there's going to be hirings without any ramifications. And so I think that's probably why there was a lot of interest in our webinar, and also why there was the nexus for the proposal that's out there to, create that potential carve out for individuals who triggered IAWP status solely because they were performing permissible job duties. But I think it's pretty clear based on that and everything that we've all seen that regardless of you triggering being an IAWP because you were recruiting a kid at a certain school, you're still an IAWP whenever you move to a non-coaching position, either at your school if you don't meet the reassignment exception or if you go to another school.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for that segue. We'll just cover real quick because we are over our time. 2017-28. Those of you on the call who have any sway to get this passed, please do. Again, in the history of this rule, the IAWP, I personally don't believe, and I think this is why this is carved out here, that it wasn't meant to be dealing with individuals in their normal course of business here between my institution and your institution. If we're, especially in the turnover of football, if they're just doing their job responsibilities, that those are heavily monitored and regulated to begin with, that those items, that those individuals get exempt from this disclosure, and I think we all shall be better for that, and having that taken off our plate if we can get this passed. And I think it's more true to the legislation and the original intent, swinging all the way back to the BFG of why we were in this space to begin with, and the evil that we were, again, supposedly trying to root out here. Great. I think that's about it. So submitted questions, we've answered a few, so thank you for your patience as we've put some into the presentation, and give us a second as we're reading some of them as they're popping up on our screens. Trace, feel free to pick up any of these. Dun, dun, dun. We did that one. Disclaimers incorporated. Great. So yeah, we've the HR disclaimers, we have put them into HR hires, and then ask individuals to sign off on an IAWP form. It just depends on when you get it here. It's sport specific. You're getting it for football, basketballs. You're getting it up front, and then we're assuming that risk for individuals outside of it. Again, if it was a direct video person for football, we'd probably be on the front foot of that a little bit more. Someone that was in maybe a marketing position that had direct contact with one of our sports instead of general job duties, we feel that. But this is a space that we're trying to get better at here at Washington. And as we've heard, it's amazing to hear the challenges that Texas has with camps. It just feels very different here in Washington, where we are a little bit more secluded, that our footprint does not include a percentage of the top 100 prospects in the country that are triggering those recruited statuses everywhere. So, it's just a friendly reminder of just how different all of us have to deal with this, and what rules and risks that are acceptable within our hiring departments, and different footprint of how we do camps as compared to how other individuals do camps or not camps. Any other questions come in? Did we get them all, Trace?
Yeah, I think so. If not, we can maybe try and scroll through and answer any questions on the community after this. And I would say just lastly, what Jackie and I would hopefully encourage you guys is reach out to us. We're by no means, I think, the experts in this, but anything that we can do to help, or things that we may have mentioned that may pique your interest, forms, disclosures, anything like that, we're definitely happy to share with you guys on the community. And we're also, super interested to hear what everybody else is doing, because it's obviously an evolving space, and I know there's a lot of best practices out there that other schools are doing that would be helpful for all of us. Yeah, and on behalf of the NAAC and the leadership, we thank you for coming today, joining us. Hope you found all this information useful. We will be putting HR disclosures forms, this PowerPoint, and recording into the NAAC community. But again, we hope that you put some, as we start that discussion, we will hope that you all post some of these questions. We'll post answers to anything that has come up in the chat sense. But again, appreciate everyone joining us today. Hope you took away a nugget, and come say hi or track us down on Twitter or on at convention. So thank you, everyone, from the great state of Washington. And Trace, do you have anything else? Final thoughts? No, that's all. Thanks, everybody, for your time. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
dun. Woohoo!